So before I begin my Passover Prophecies video series, I want to talk a little bit about dates. I've been talking about dates and timelines for quite a while now, and a couple of videos ago I talked about how Jesus will most likely return in 2029 with a rapture this year, 2025 in the fall. And then the abomination of desolation would happen in 2026. The Jews have only 3.5 years left for the reign of the beast, the great tribulation for Israel. And then Christ will return on the Day of Atonement in 2029. Then from 2029 to 2031 would be the construction of the Millennial Temple, the setting up of the administration and all of that for Christ's rule, until finally in 2031 we would see the presence of God coming into the millennial temple, manifesting as the glory of God. We read about that in Ezekiel 43. And this is all stuff that I've talked about in previous videos. So we know that Jesus was crucified on Passover. And the trick now is really trying to discover which Passover year he was crucified in. And what I'm going to attempt to prove in this video is that most of the evidence for the date of Christ's Passover, and thus also the date of his first coming, points to 31 AD. That this was the year that Christ was crucified. Now, we do have trouble when we're going from Hebrew calendars to Gregorian calendars and a Julian calendar and all of that. And so we know that calendars are a bit of a problem here. One of the benefits we do have living in this day and age of computers and research and all of that is we do have access to pretty good indications of when things occurred in the past, making conversions from the Gregorian calendar to the Julian calendar and also to the Hebrew calendar, which is makes it a lot easier for those of us who are doing research. So today I'm going to give you evidence for a 31 AD Passover crucifixion of Christ from several different sources. Two of them are going to be biblical sources. One of them is going to be from the Naval Observatory records, and another one will be from Chinese records. So one of the first things we kind of really need to do as background is establish which day of the week did Jesus die. We know that when the women came to the tomb early on the first day of the week, that the tomb had already been opened, that the stone had been rolled away. Jesus was already gone. Okay, while it was still dark on the first day of the week, Jesus was already resurrected. He was already alive. So if we work backward from the first day of the week, we can actually find out which day of the week Jesus was crucified on. Now, most people think he died on Friday, on Good Friday, and he was raised on Sunday. And those days are wrong. Okay, they don't make sense. They're not biblically supported. So they're basically just tradition. They came out of Catholicism or somewhere else, but they're not accurate. All right, so if Jesus died on a Friday, he would have been buried before sundown. Okay, he was buried on Passover. He was not buried on the next day. He was actually buried the same day that he died. That would mean that he was in the grave on what we would call Friday night, and also Saturday night. Okay, those are 2 nights. And how many days would he be in the grave? Well, he'd be in the grave all day Saturday. And if he rose on Sunday, that would be it. So we're just looking at Friday night and Saturday night. And he would be in the grave on Saturday and then rise from the dead on the first day of the week, which is Sunday. So do we see 3 days and 3 nights here? No, we don't. So let's take a look at a Wednesday crucifixion. Okay, so if Jesus died on a Wednesday, which is the fourth day of the week, okay, Friday is the sixth day, Wednesday is the fourth day. Okay, how many nights and how many days? Okay, well, he would be in the grave on Wednesday night and Thursday night and Friday night. And he would be in the grave on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday until sundown. Okay, three days, 3 nights. And then once the sun went down on Saturday on the Sabbath, well, that would begin the first day of the week. And so sometime after sundown on the Sabbath day, that's when Jesus would rise from the dead. So in order to have the 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, according to what Jesus said about himself, you would have to have the crucifixion taking place on a Wednesday. So the evidence here is pointing to a Wednesday crucifixion. Okay, 3 days and 3 nights, you've got to have a Wednesday crucifixion. Is there evidence that sometime in the first century, in between 29 and 33 AD, is there a Wednesday crucifixion? And to find that out, we would actually go to this astronomical data that comes from the U.S. Naval Observatory Astronomical Applications Department. Okay, and I'm going to leave this, a copy of this is going to be in the show notes here, so you can read this for yourself. And the U.S. Navy Observatory actually uses the Julian calendar. Okay, so the dates that you see on here on this chart are going to be the Julian dates. And why is that important? Well, it's important because these dates were used right around the time of Christ. The Julian calendar, Julius Caesar used this calendar, and you can coincide the Hebrew dates by looking at the spring equinox and when the beginning of the month was, and all of that. That would help you find the Hebrew dates. So you take a look at what was going on in the sun, moon, and stars, and then you also can line that up with the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar is the accurate one, and that is the one that the U.S. Naval Observatory uses, and it is the calendar dates that are on this particular chart. So if you look at this chart here, what you'll see is when the equinox occurred and when the visible new moon occurred, which would then calculate the first day of the first month of Nisan, and then you would know what is the 14th day of Nisan. In this case, it would be Wednesday, April 25th on the Julian calendar. Okay, the April 25th on the Julian calendar. So recently a brother did a video. He was using this information, but I don't think he realized that this was already in the Julian calendar, and he was making a conversion, thinking this was Gregorian dates and then trying to, convert it to Julian dates, but it's already in the Julian calendar. So he had assumed that the 32 AD Monday Passover, that if you do this fancy conversion, you'll end up with a Wednesday Passover, which he was trying to do that to show that the Passover was on a Wednesday, and it is on a Wednesday, but you can't do what he did because it's already Julian dates here. It's not Gregorian. So anyway, Wednesday, April 25th, the Julian date, is when the Passover took place in 31 AD. 31 AD. So far, what we've got are 2 pieces of evidence. One is the idea of 3 days and 3 nights in the grave leads you to a Wednesday crucifixion. And then when you get to the U.S. Naval Observatory astronomical calculations, you find that indeed in AD 31 there was a Wednesday Passover. Okay, so here we've got, a couple of pieces of evidence. The first one is you got to have a Wednesday crucifixion, and the second piece is the U.S. Naval Observatory Astronomical what do they call this? Astronomical Applications Department puts Passover on a Wednesday in 31 AD. The next thing we want to look at is the 70th week prophecy, the 70th week of Daniel. Because the 70th week of Daniel actually tells us what year Jesus began his ministry. Okay, so I want to take a look at a verse that's very seldom quoted by people who teach on Daniel's 70th week. It's Daniel 9:25, the first part. "No one understand this, from the issuance of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Okay, from the decree until Messiah the Prince, there's going to be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. So from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem until the appearance of the Messiah, there is going to be a total of 483 years, because every week of years is 7 years. Now, the fact that these groups of years are represented as groups of 7 years tells us, well, it would tell any Jewish person who's reading this, that it's sabbatical years. And every Jewish person knows that when you're counting sabbatical years, you're going to start in the fall with the Feast of Trumpets. That's how this works. So the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem was issued in 457 BC by Artaxerxes. And then Ezra arrived in Israel just prior to the beginning of the fall feasts in 457 BC. If you add 483 years to that, it places the arrival of the Messiah in 27 AD. Okay, 27 AD. The beginning of the 70th week is in 27 AD. So the middle of the week was when the sacrifices and offering were put to rest. Okay, that's when Jesus came. He confirmed the covenant with many. Okay, his blood was the blood of the new covenant. He put to rest the old Mosaic sacrifices when he died on the cross. All of that was put to rest. Cause the sacrifices and offerings to cease, that is, they will be put to rest. It's the same root word where we get our word Sabbath, and that would be in the middle of that last group of 7 years. So 3.5 years after Christ first came is when these sacrifices would be put to rest because of his ultimate sacrifice on the cross. So if you add 3.5 years to the fall of 27 AD, you're going to get 31 AD, and this would be in the spring. Okay, so the 70th week of Daniel actually gives us an indication of when Christ would die as well. Passover in 31 AD. And recently, I was reminded of a video that I had actually watched. Other people had done excerpts of this video that talked about the Chinese records from 31 AD that I'm going to leave a link for. But anyway, these Chinese records actually talked about some very interesting celestial signs that took place in 31 AD in April. Well, what would coincide with April of our Gregorian year. The fourth piece of evidence that I have to offer would be the Chinese records. And I'm going to invite you to watch that video. It's a pretty short one, and I'll leave a link for that in the description box below, so you can watch that. It's very interesting. Okay, so we've got This evidence here, 4 different pieces of evidence that point to a crucifixion in 31 AD, especially a crucifixion that takes place on a Wednesday, which would need to happen in order for Christ to be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. All right, so what I want to do right now is actually take a look at how the month of Nisan went at the time of Christ. I realized that Christ did not die on Wednesday. Wednesday didn't exist back then. If you're thinking like a Hebrew, it would have been on the 4th day of the week. Okay, the 4th day of the week. It's when the sun, moon, and stars were put in the heavens, and they were given for signs and for seasons, that is, for calculating the Moedim, the feasts of the Lord, which are actually prophecy. So Passover and Tabernacles and all these feast days are actually prophecy. One of the reasons for the sun, moon, and stars was to help us be able to calculate when prophetic events were going to take place. And one of the things that God has done for us is that he's put sort of miraculous signs in the heavens so that they get our attention, so that we can know that something is happening, some kind of inflection point is taking place in God's plan of redemption. So one of the things that happened in the sun, moon, and stars at Jesus' crucifixion was the sun went dark for 3 hours. Some people want to say that this solar and lunar eclipse thing that happened at the time of Christ when he was crucified is an actual predictable event that you can just, go to Stellarium or whatever and look at when these eclipses happened and say that what happened when Jesus was on the cross was that eclipse. But that isn't what's going on here. At the time that Jesus died, the sun went dark for 3 hours. There is no such thing as a solar eclipse during a full moon, which is what happens on Passover. It's a full moon. So these signs in the heavens would have gotten people's attention. Okay, and anything that happened in Israel with regard to the sun and the moon and so on, especially if you've got a 3-hour long solar eclipse, would also probably be noticed in other parts of the world. And I think that's why the Chinese records are so interesting and important as, sort of supplemental material. So Jesus died on the 4th day of the week, which in our understanding of how we think about things with our calendar would be on a Wednesday. Okay, this would be on a Wednesday. So that is the 4th day of the Hebrew week. So they just number things. So Sunday is the 1st day of the week. Monday would be the 2nd day, Tuesday 3rd, Wednesday would be the 4th day of the week, and on through the Sabbath day when the women went to the tomb on the 1st day of the week while it was still dark, because remember Hebrew days begin after sunset at night. Okay, and continue on until sunset the following day. They don't begin in the morning with the sunrise. They don't start at midnight. Okay, and this is kind of a hard adaptation that we need to make as Westerners. So I'm going to be talking about things in terms that we can understand. So I'm going to use the word Wednesday and Sunday. I'm just doing it so that we can know how to think about it. I'm making a translation here basically because these things are not familiar to us. So in 31 AD, Nisan 1, the beginning of the month, fell on a Thursday, okay? Okay, Nisan 1 was on a Thursday. Okay, that was on the 5th day of the week. It was on a Thursday. The Gospel of John also tells us that 6 days before Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who'd been raised from the dead. So we know that Passover is on the 14th. Okay, Nisan 14, that's Passover. And that was a Wednesday, remember? And if you subtract 6 days, you're going to end up on Nisan 8. And this was when Jesus arrived in Bethany. Okay, now Bethany is where Jesus stayed when he came to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast. He never spent the night in Jerusalem. He would either go across the Kidron Valley and spend the night at the Mount of Olives, or he would go and hang out in Bethany with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And that's what he did. And it's also recorded that there was a big supper, a feast that was held for Jesus in his honor. So on Nisan 10, that's when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. So this is what we would call the triumphal entry. Most of us have been taught that this happened on Sunday, that this was Palm Sunday. Actually, this happened on a Sabbath day. It was on the seventh day. This day right here, Nisan 10, is a really, really important day when you're talking about the Passover, because that was the day when people chose their lambs. Okay, they chose their lamb on Nisan 10. They sacrificed their lamb on Nisan 14. So Jesus would have been chosen by the people on this day right here, Nisan 10. This is when the lambs were chosen. Jesus was the Lamb of God. And for 4 days, the lambs would be inspected. They would be living with the people. They would be looked at, inspected, and so on. And for 4 days, the Jewish leaders inspected Christ. They questioned him. They asked him all kinds of questions. And even up until the day that Jesus died, Pilate said that he found no fault in him. So there was nothing, no fault at all with the Lamb of God after inspection. On Nisan 14, this would have been the 4th day of the week and a Wednesday. And this was the day that Jesus died. And he died between the evenings when the Passover lambs were slain. And he was actually buried on Passover. The thing was with the Jews is that if you committed a crime and you were hung on a tree, whether through crucifixion, hanging, or whatever, your body had to be buried that same day. And this is in Deuteronomy 23, 22, and 23. And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he's put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So the Jews were under the impression, because of this law right here, that any Jewish person who was crucified, or probably any person who was crucified and hanging on a cross that day, including the thieves that were with Jesus, had to be taken down. They had to be buried that same day, lest the land be defiled. And, this just goes to show how people can try to get it right and get everything wrong. That, you crucify the Son of God and then you want him buried, get rid of the evidence before the next day. Kind of sad but true. And even Paul in Galatians quotes this passage, and he says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." And he's talking about how Christ took the curse for us. He died on Passover, which was on a Wednesday. And then right away on the next day, Nisan 15, which began what we would call that night of Passover. So Jesus died on Passover. He was buried, put in the tomb real quickly before sundown, and then at sundown began the 15th day of Nisan. And this was the first day of unleavened bread. This was a really important day. It was a sacred day, and this was called a high Sabbath day. And this is according to Leviticus 23, verses 4 through 8. So this was a high Sabbath. Okay, this was not the weekly Sabbath. This wasn't the seventh day Sabbath. This was a high Sabbath that was on the day after Passover. So this would have been on a Thursday. That's how we would look at that. And no work was to be done. Nobody could come to the tomb and do anything because everybody was supposed to rest because this was a high Sabbath. The following day, Nisan 16, was actually a Friday. It was the day of preparation for the Sabbath. Okay, so we're going to call it the preparation day. It's a Friday, the 6th day. It was also the day when first fruits were offered. Okay, first fruits of the barley. This is when the priests went out and cut the barley and they offered it to the Lord. This was a sheaf of grain, and Leviticus 23:11 says, "He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord so that it may be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath." So a lot of people think we're talking about the 7th day Sabbath here, and that would be why Jesus then would be raised on first fruits. But we're not talking about the 7th day Sabbath here. We're talking about this Sabbath here. Okay, the high Sabbath. On the day after the high Sabbath, that was when the first fruits were offered. Okay, but Jesus is still in the grave here because he is not going to be raised until Nisan 17. Okay, 3 days and 3 nights that he's in the grave. I know a lot of people will quote to me that Jesus was the first fruits of the dead, and yes, he was. That's if you're using the harvest imagery that Paul is using in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, and then Paul goes on to talk about the main harvest of those who fall asleep, which are all those who are his at his coming. And then, like all harvests, there is also a third part of the harvest, which is the gleanings, and that is then comes the end, and that's when he hands the kingdom, and it's at that time that that third harvest of souls is brought in at the great white throne judgment, that resurrection. So there is, though, a fulfillment of this feast of first fruits. This has to be fulfilled by Christ in some way. It wasn't fulfilled by his resurrection taking place on that day. There was something else that was happening. And I've done videos on this before, so this may sound familiar to some of you. Exodus 13:15. "You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread, as I commanded you. You shall eat unleavened bread for 7 days at the appointed time in the month of Abib," or Nisan. "For in it you came out of Egypt." And then there is this phrase, "None shall appear before me empty-handed." Okay, no one shall appear before the Lord empty-handed. Actually, this includes Christ. At all of these first fruits feasts, he is actually presenting some harvest to the Lord. So what is the harvest that Christ is presenting to the Lord so that he does not appear empty-handed? Well, this would be the souls, the righteous dead, the people of faith who were in Sheol. Remember, the place of the dead. 1 Peter 3:18 and 19. "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison." So when Jesus was made alive in the spirit, he still hadn't been raised from the dead. He went and preached to the spirits in prison. And according to Ephesians 4:8 through 10, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean? But that he also descended to the lower regions of the earth. He who descended is the one who ascended far above all heavens, that he might fill all things. So when Christ descended into Sheol, into the realm of the dead, he took the righteous, faithful dead with him into heaven. So these people of faith that we read about in Hebrews, Abraham, Abel, Isaac, Jacob, all these people that we read about in Hebrews 11, he brought their spirits with him into heaven. That was his first fruits presentation of the barley harvest. And it's a sheaf, okay? It's a sheaf of grain. It's not a finished product like the loaves of bread that are offered at Pentecost 50 days later. The first fruits that were offered were the faithful dead whose spirits were brought out of Sheol, okay? Those who had faith in Christ before he even appeared on the scene, okay? And you can read about that in Hebrews 11. And they are present in heaven. They are that great cloud of witnesses who are our examples and our encouragement as we walk in our walk of faith. So Jesus was resurrected on Nisan 17. Nisan 17 would have started at sundown on the Sabbath day. And the first day of the week actually begins at sundown on the Sabbath. Okay, so as soon as the sun goes down, well, now we've got the first day of the week. And that would have been when Jesus rose from the dead. He would have risen from the dead like at night, like after sundown. And the other thing that happened when Jesus rose from the dead is that there were people who were resurrected who were resurrected when Jesus was resurrected. Okay, they were put back into their old bodies the same way Lazarus went into his old body, and they would have to die again. But Jesus couldn't bring all of the faithful with him into heaven because you always have to leave some. And rather than leave them in Sheol until the time of the end, they were resurrected into their bodies, and then they appeared to people who recognized them, and they would be able to share what they saw when Jesus went into the grave. So Jesus would have resurrected on Nisan 17, which would have begun basically Saturday night. And so when the women came to the tomb on Sunday morning, the first day of the week here, that's when they would have found the tomb empty. That's when Jesus would have appeared to the women. That's when they knew that the grave was empty. Okay, so all of this follows actually the Passover pattern of Nisan 1, which is the new beginning of the year for the Jews. Nisan 8 is when Jesus would have gone into Bethany so that he could be ready to be chosen as the lamb on Nisan 10, which in this case was on a Sabbath day. On Nisan 14, 4 days later, he, as the Passover lamb, he was slain. Nisan 15 is the first day of unleavened bread. It's a high Sabbath. Nobody can do any work. Nobody could go to the grave or do anything. On Nisan 16th, preparation day, the women bought the spices. And this is when the first fruits of the faithful dead were offered to God by Christ. No one can appear before the Lord empty-handed. That includes Jesus. And then at sundown on this day, which would begin Nisan 17, is when Christ raised from the dead, 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. I think all of this is supporting a Wednesday crucifixion. According to the U.S. Naval Astronomical Observation, which uses the Julian calendar, Jesus died on a Wednesday in 31 AD. Daniel chapter 9, we know that there were 483 years from the time that the decree was issued until Messiah the Prince. So that would be at the beginning of the 70th week, because it's after 7 weeks and 62 weeks, which is 69 weeks of years. After that, Messiah would come in the 70th week, and that was in 27 AD. You add the 3.5 years, and you come to Passover of 31 AD for the crucifixion of Christ. Now, what that means is that Christ's first coming fulfilled the first half of Daniel's 70th week, and that Christ is going to return at the time of the abomination to lead the remnant of Israel into the wilderness. That's according to Zechariah 14. You also see that sort of tucked there in Matthew 24 as well. And that's when Jesus is going to resume his involvement with the nation of Israel, and mainly by protecting them in the wilderness for that final 3.5 years of that 70th week of Daniel. At the end of that 70th week, what you have is a jubilee. Okay, so when Jesus came at the beginning of the 70th week, the beginning of that last group of 7 years, he came at the end of a sabbatical year. But it wasn't a year of Jubilee. It won't be a year of Jubilee until the end of the 70th week. So when that 70th week ends, it will be a Jubilee year. Christ will return, and from there on out, Israel will never again, ever, ever, ever rebel. They will be the ones who remain faithful to the Lord for the whole millennial reign, even when Satan is released at that during that little season. Israel will remain faithful to the Lord the whole time. That's what I have. I really encourage you to download the show notes. Take a look at the information there. Take a look at the video about the Chinese emperor who saw some really strange things in the sky in 31 AD and the interesting things he said. Kind of a revelation of spiritual understanding that I think the Lord gave him. And you'll see how this is the date right here, 31 AD. And personally, I only believe that Israel has 3.5 years left. The book of Revelation gives us the events that are going to take place just prior to the abomination of desolation. In fact, most of the events of Revelation take place in the few months prior to the abomination of desolation. So that's what I have for you today. Take a look at the resources that are available to you in the description box below. There's so much stuff. And leave a comment in the comments section, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.